What breaks a man first in the desert? The heat that climbs past 120 degrees and turns your helmet into an oven. The thirst that makes you hallucinate water that doesn't exist. The sand that gets into everything, including your rifle's action, and threatens to turn your weapon into a useless club. Or the enemy who knows this terrain and uses it as a weapon more effective than their tanks and artillery. When you're marching through the Tunisian desert in 1943 chasing Rommel's Afrika Korps, when your water ration is half what you need and your feet are covered in blisters and the sun is an enemy, more relentless than the Germans. What keeps you moving forward instead of collapsing into the sand and accepting defeat? And what does it mean to fight your first major campaign in a landscape so alien, so hostile to human survival, that simply enduring becomes an act of courage equal to any battlefield heroics? I'm 95 years old, and in the spring of 1943, I was a 20-year-old, private in the United States Army's 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, fighting my way across North Africa in conditions that tested us more severely than any enemy action, learning that modern warfare required not just tactical skill, but the ability to survive environments that nature never intended humans to inhabit. This is my story of that march through the desert, of discovering the limits of human endurance and somehow pushing beyond them, of understanding that sometimes the real enemy isn't the one shooting at you but the one surrounding you in every direction, with no escape possible. My name is James Robert Sullivan, and I was born in Chicago in 1923, grew up during the Depression, enlisted in the Army in early 1942 after Pearl Harbor, because like millions of other young Americans, I wanted to do my part to win the war. I completed basic training at Fort Riley, Kansas, was assigned to the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, and shipped to England in August 1942 for additional training before the division's first major combat operation. We trained in the English countryside through the fall, practiced amphibious landings and live fire exercises, prepared for combat without knowing where or when we'd be committed to battle. The training was thorough, covered infantry tactics and weapons and small unit operations, but it didn't prepare us for the specific challenges of desert warfare, because nobody knew we'd be fighting in North Africa until shortly before the invasion. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, began on November 8, 1942, with landings in Morocco and Algeria designed to trap Axis forces in Tunisia between British forces advancing from the east and American forces advancing from the west. The 1st Infantry Division landed near Oran, Algeria, encountered minimal resistance from Vichy French forces, and quickly pushed inland toward Tunisia. The strategic objective was to capture Tunisia before German reinforcements could arrive and establish defensive positions, to close the trap on Rommel's Afrika Korps, and eliminate the Axis presence in North Africa before invading Europe from the south. But the campaign didn't unfold as planned. The Germans reinforced faster than anticipated. The terrain favored defenders, and what was supposed to be a quick campaign turned into months of grinding combat in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. We advanced through Algeria in late 1942 and into Tunisia in early 1943, fighting through mountains and then descending into the coastal plains and desert that would become the primary battlefield for the campaign's final phase. And that's where we encountered conditions that no training had prepared us for, where the desert itself became an enemy that killed and injured as effectively as German weapons. The first shock was the heat, temperatures that in winter were tolerable, but that as spring arrived climbed to levels that seemed incompatible with human survival. By April 1943, daytime temperatures were regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes reaching 120 or higher, heat that turned metal equipment too hot to touch with bare hands, that made marching in full combat load almost impossible, that caused heat casualties even when we weren't in contact with the enemy. We'd march before dawn and after dusk when temperatures were marginally cooler, try to rest during the hottest midday hours. But the tactical situation often required movement regardless of temperature, and we'd march through heat that felt like walking through a furnace. The second shock was the water shortage, or more precisely, the inadequacy of our water supply for the conditions we faced. Each soldier was issued 1 or 2 canteens, maybe 2 quarts of water per day, which would be sufficient in temperate climates, but was barely survival level in the desert heat. We were supposed to receive water resupply daily, but the logistics of operating in the desert meant supply convoys were often delayed or attacked, and we'd go days with less water than we needed, rationing carefully while watching men collapse from dehydration. The temptation to drink all your water immediately was overwhelming. The thirst was constant and maddening. But discipline required saving water for the hours when you'd need it most. Men who couldn't maintain that discipline, who drank their entire ration in the morning, would be casualties by afternoon, would require medical evacuation for dehydration that left them unable to function. The third shock was the sand, the omnipresent fine dust that got into everything, that clogged weapons and fouled engines and made maintenance a constant battle against the environment. Your rifle would be clean in the morning. By afternoon, sand would have infiltrated the action, and you'd have to field strip and clean it to ensure it would fire when needed. Vehicle engines required constant attention. Air filters changed daily, oil checked continuously, because sand in an engine meant mechanical failure, and a disabled vehicle in the desert meant death for its crew if they couldn't be recovered quickly. We learned to wrap equipment in cloth, to seal openings with tape, to clean and maintain obsessively. But the sand was relentless, and ultimately got into everything regardless of precautions. My company entered the final phase of the Tunisia campaign in late April 1943, part of a general offensive to break through German defensive lines and capture Tunis, the capital, and the last major Axis stronghold in North Africa. The offensive required advancing across open desert terrain, attacking prepared positions, maintaining pressure on an enemy that was well-trained and well-equipped, and fighting desperately, because they knew surrender meant the end of the Afrika Korps and the loss of North Africa. The fighting was intense, casualties were heavy, and the physical demands of operating in the desert made everything harder than comparable operations in Europe would have been. We advanced in late April and early May, marching and fighting across landscapes that seemed designed to kill us, through heat that peaked above 120 degrees, with water supplies that were chronically inadequate, facing an enemy that used the terrain as a weapon, and that retreated in good order while making us pay for every mile gained. The march was brutal. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Feet developed blisters that became infected and led to casualties as surely as enemy fire. Equipment failures mounted as the desert took its toll on vehicles and weapons, and morale eroded as we pushed forward through conditions that seemed to have no end. I remember one particular day, May 3, 1943, that encapsulated the entire experience of fighting in the desert, and that has remained vivid in my memory for 79 years. We'd been ordered to advance across an open plain, maybe 8 miles of flat sandy terrain with no cover, to reach an objective where intelligence suggested German forces were establishing defensive positions. The march would begin before dawn to take advantage of cooler temperatures, but even at 400 when we started moving, the temperature was already in the 80s and climbing. We moved in company formation, about 120 men spread across the desert, carrying full combat loads, each step sinking into sand that made walking exhausting, the weight of equipment grinding down our shoulders and backs. By 0700, 3 hours into the march, the sun was fully up and the temperature was climbing past 100 degrees. Men were already struggling. The water in our canteens was hot enough to burn your mouth, and we still had maybe 5 miles to cover before reaching the objective. Lieutenant Harrison, our platoon leader, called a rest break, 10 minutes in whatever shade we could find, though there was no shade in that flat desert plain. We sat in the sand, tried to conserve energy, rationed water carefully knowing we had hours more marching ahead and not knowing when resupply would come. Private Eddie Morrison from Detroit collapsed during that rest break, heat exhaustion that turned into heat stroke, his body's cooling system overwhelmed by the conditions. The medics tried to treat him, poured water on him to cool him down even though water was precious, but he was in bad shape and needed immediate evacuation. We had no vehicles with us. The medical evacuation would have to come from the rear, but radio communication was spotty, and we didn't know how long it would take for help to arrive. We left Morrison with a medic and 2 men to protect them, continued our march, knowing he might not survive but having no choice because the mission required us to reach the objective before the Germans could strengthen their positions. The march continued through temperatures that climbed above 115 degrees, heat that made thinking difficult and coordinated movement almost impossible. Men were hallucinating, seeing water that didn't exist, stumbling and falling and having to be helped up by comrades who were barely functional themselves. I was carrying my M1 Garand rifle, 70 pounds of equipment and ammunition, and every step was an act of will. Every mile took concentration and determination that I didn't know I possessed. The physical pain was overwhelming, feet blistering in boots that weren't designed for desert conditions, shoulders raw from pack straps, head pounding from dehydration despite careful water rationing. But stopping meant failing the mission and letting down the men depending on me. We reached the objective around 1400 hours, 10 hours after starting the march, having covered 8 miles that in normal conditions would take maybe 2 hours, but that in the desert heat had taken 5 times as long. We found German positions, but they were abandoned. The enemy had withdrawn during the night, and we'd marched through hell to take an objective that was no longer defended. The frustration was immense. The sense that our suffering had accomplished nothing was demoralizing, but this was the nature of the campaign. The Germans would retreat and we'd pursue, and the physical demands would continue regardless of whether we made contact with the enemy. We established defensive positions, dug foxholes in sand that collapsed as fast as we could dig it, tried to rest during the hottest part of the afternoon while waiting for water and food resupply. The supply convoy arrived around 1700 hours, brought water and rations and news that Morrison had been evacuated and would probably survive, though he wouldn't return to the unit. Small comfort, knowing we'd lost a man to the desert rather than to enemy action, but loss was loss regardless of the cause. Over the following weeks, as the offensive continued and we pushed toward Tunis, the pattern repeated. March through impossible heat, fight occasional engagements with retreating German forces, take casualties from the environment as well as from combat, advance a few more miles, repeat. The physical toll was cumulative. Men who'd been strong at the start of the campaign were worn down by heat and dehydration and exhaustion. Units were operating at reduced strength because of environmental casualties, and everyone was pushed to the edge of what human beings could endure. But we adapted, learned techniques for surviving the desert that training hadn't taught us, developed practices that helped us maintain combat effectiveness despite the conditions. We learned to start marches in the hours before dawn, to rest during the hottest midday hours, to resume movement in late afternoon when temperatures began to drop. We learned to wrap our heads in cloth soaked with water when water was available, creating makeshift cooling systems that provided minimal relief, but that made the heat slightly more bearable. We learned to share water with men who were worse off than we were, to watch out for signs of heat exhaustion in our comrades, to maintain unit cohesion even when individual survival instincts screamed at us to preserve our own resources. We learned to maintain our weapons obsessively, to clean them multiple times per day, to wrap them when not in use to keep sand out of the actions. We learned that metal objects left in the sun became too hot to touch, that you had to be careful about what you touched with bare hands or you'd get burned. We learned to dig foxholes differently, to line them with whatever material we could find to prevent the constant sand collapse that made proper defensive positions almost impossible. We learned that the desert was an enemy that required constant vigilance and adaptation, that could kill as effectively as German weapons if we didn't respect its dangers. The Battle of Tunisia culminated in early May 1943 with the capture of Tunis and Bizerte and the surrender of over 250,000 Axis troops, effectively eliminating the Axis presence in North Africa and opening the way for the invasion of Sicily and eventually Italy. The 1st Infantry Division fought throughout the campaign, took over 3,000 casualties killed and wounded, proved itself in combat, and earned its reputation as one of the Army's premier fighting divisions. But the cost had been terrible, not just in casualties but in the physical and psychological toll of fighting, in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. I survived the Tunisia campaign, fought through Sicily and landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, fought across France and into Germany. But Tunisia remained the campaign that defined my understanding of what soldiers could endure, that proved humans were capable of functioning in environments that seemed incompatible with survival, that demonstrated the importance of adaptation and will and mutual support in overcoming conditions that should have defeated us. The march through the desert, those weeks of pushing forward through heat and thirst and sand, taught me more about myself and about human capacity than any subsequent combat experience. The question I've pondered for decades is what kept us moving during that march. What combination of factors prevented us from simply giving up and accepting defeat when the physical conditions seemed overwhelming? Part of it was training, the conditioning that had built physical endurance and the discipline that allowed us to function despite discomfort. Part of it was duty, the understanding that we had a mission to accomplish and that others were depending on us. Part of it was pride, the refusal to be broken by conditions that previous American soldiers had survived, the determination to prove we were as tough as the men who'd come before us. But mostly, I think, it was mutual support, the bonds between soldiers that made individual survival dependent on collective endurance. When you saw your buddy struggling, you helped him even though you were struggling yourself. When someone collapsed, you shared your water even though your own thirst was overwhelming. When morale flagged, someone would make a joke or tell a story or do something to lift spirits even though he was as miserable as everyone else. That mutual support, that refusal to let your comrades fail even when you were at the edge of failure yourself, was what kept us moving when individual will would have faltered. I came home from the war in 1945, used the GI Bill to attend college, became a high school teacher, married and raised 4 children, lived a normal middle-class American life, but the desert never left me. Remained present in memories that surfaced at unexpected times, in nightmares about thirst and heat that woke me decades after the war ended, in an appreciation for water and shade and comfort that people who hadn't experienced the desert couldn't quite understand. I couldn't take water for granted after Tunisia, couldn't waste it or fail to appreciate its availability, couldn't forget what it felt like to need water desperately and have only a few swallows available. I've returned to Tunisia twice, once in the 1990s for a veteran reunion, and once in 2015 with my grandchildren who wanted to see where I'd fought. The desert hasn't changed much, still hostile to human presence, still capable of killing the unprepared, still beautiful in its stark emptiness. Walking that terrain again, seeing the plains we'd crossed and the positions we'd fought over, brought back memories so vivid it felt like I was 20 years old again, marching through impossible heat toward objectives that sometimes existed and sometimes didn't. The question younger generations ask me is whether the Tunisia campaign was worth it, whether the casualties and suffering achieved objectives that justified the cost. The military answer is yes, the campaign eliminated the Axis presence in North Africa, opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, provided a proving ground for American forces that would go on to fight in Europe, demonstrated that we could compete with and defeat the veteran German forces that had conquered most of Europe. The strategic value was clear and significant. But the personal answer is more complicated. Was it worth Morrison's heat stroke and near death? Was it worth the thousands of environmental casualties that didn't appear in the official battle statistics, but that left men damaged and traumatized? Was it worth the physical and psychological toll on soldiers who survived but who carried the scars of that desert march for the rest of their lives? From my perspective as someone who lived it, I honestly don't know. We accomplished the mission, won the campaign, contributed to eventual victory. But the cost was real and lasting, and affected us in ways that are hard to quantify or explain to people who weren't there. What I do know is that the march through the desert taught me about human capacity and resilience, about what we can endure when we have no choice, about the importance of adaptation and mutual support and maintaining hope, even in conditions that seem hopeless. Those lessons served me throughout the war and throughout my life afterward, shaped how I approached challenges and adversity, made me more confident in my ability to handle whatever came, because I'd already survived something that should have broken me. I'm 95 years old now, one of the last surviving veterans of the Tunisia campaign, one of the few who can still bear first-hand witness to what that desert march was like and what it demanded of us. When I'm gone, which will be soon, the lived experience will be lost, replaced by history books and documentaries and academic studies that can describe what happened, but can't quite capture what it felt like, what it meant to push forward through heat and thirst and sand when every instinct screamed to stop. That's why I'm telling this story now, while I still can, while the memories remain sharp even as other things fade. The march through the desert wasn't the most dramatic campaign of World War II, didn't have the fame of D-Day or the Bulge or the island campaigns in the Pacific, but it was significant, was formative for the American Army. was the place where we learned we could compete with and defeat the Germans, where we proved to ourselves and to our allies that American soldiers could endure conditions and accomplish missions that would have been considered impossible before we attempted them. The desert, that hostile environment that seemed designed to kill us, became our training ground, the place where we learned what we were capable of, where boys became veterans and where units forged bonds that would carry them through subsequent campaigns. We marched through conditions that should have defeated us, survived when survival seemed impossible, accomplished objectives that required us to function beyond normal human limits. That achievement, that demonstration of what determined soldiers could accomplish despite overwhelming adversity, was Tunisia's real legacy. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand what soldiers endured in the North Africa campaign and what the desert demanded of men who fought there, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember the soldiers who marched through the Tunisian desert in 1943, who fought heat and thirst and sand while chasing an enemy that used the terrain as a weapon, who survived conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. Remember that sometimes the real enemy isn't the one you're fighting, but the environment you're fighting in. That survival itself can be an act of courage, that pushing forward when everything tells you to stop requires a kind of strength that deserves recognition. Thank you for listening to this old soldier's memories of the march through the desert and the lessons learned when nature became an enemy more relentless than any human adversary.